Hey guys, so I'm doing another video on orphanages of the 1800s, and this is a follow-up video to my previous one on insane asylums, orphan asylums, and orphan trains, and that there's a connection between these, that these orphan asylums, these insane asylums, the orphan trains that were used to distribute children that were broken up from their family to indoctrinate them in orphanages, in these institutions, these indoctrination centers, that these old world buildings that we see here, for example, this Brooklyn Orphan Asylum, and we'll see several more, specifically in New York City, that these were old world buildings that were repurposed by the Illuminati, by Freemasons, for children to re-educate and re-indoctrinate and indoctrinate them in Satan's little season, at the beginning of Satan's little season, after they were broken up from their families. That the Millennial Reign of Christ is no longer going to be known as this glorious time with these old world buildings and peace within that kingdom, but it was going to be renamed the Dark Ages. And they had to break up families who did not go along with this new narrative and re-educate the children of those families. And the parents of those families, if they did not go along with this new narrative, were placed in insane asylums where they were re-educated. And if that didn't work through torture techniques, then they began to try to change their memories through drugs, through surgeries, such as frontal lobotomies. That's the reason that these type of what we look at now as torturous techniques and condemn the things that were done in these mental asylums in the going into the early 1900s, that this was the original reason that these things were done within them. These glorious buildings were changed into an evil, corrupt institution to house those who did not go along with this new narrative of this new era at the beginning of Satan's little season. These are where the children went to re-educate them. And we're going to see so many old world buildings like this one, the Brooklyn Orphan Asylum, the Catholic Orphan Asylum. Again, all these in New York City. There's so many that were in New York City in the 1800s. And I think the reason is during Satan's little season at the beginning, which I proposed was 1776 at the founding of the Illuminati, the time period that we know as where the United States declared independence, that this was the time that Satan was released from the abyss, from the bottomless pit, to begin his little season. People that were in this transition period that rejected Christ, that hated the millennial kingdom, hated his kingdom, were looking forward to this day of release of the Illuminati, the Luciferian doctrine, to begin. And they wanted to be a part of it. And this is the result of this first few decades of Satan's little season. Old world buildings like you see here, reclaimed, usurped by Freemasons, by the Illuminati, and the children from families that were divided during that time who did not go along with this narrative, they were placed into buildings like this to re-educate them with the ancient history, like we saw on the last video, that John McLean, who was a professor at Harvard University in the late 1700s and was also a Freemason, he wrote the textbook on what the ancient history was. And so him, along with many others like him who rewrote the history books, were re-educating the children of this time, the children of the transition from the Millennial Reign of Christ to Satan's little season, placing them in institution centers like this, re-educating them to say, no, the previous time period was not the Millennial Reign of Christ. It was known as the Dark Ages, this period, this 1,000-year period of death and disease, and nothing great came out of it. There's nothing good, no great accomplishments. And it was a period of stagnation, of humanity, and there are no advancements. And that the modern history that they were rewriting, or that this glorious time period upcoming, was going to be a time of great advancements. And that to put your trust in this history, to put your trust in this science, in this technology. And we are the children of these children coming out of the millennial reign of Christ into Satan's little season. Just like they were indoctrinated back then, we are continuing to be indoctrinated. And it starts at birth. And I showed you many videos about the deception, how much spiritual deception there is in this world, and how much has gone on in the last 250 years plus. So, again, this is the Orphan Asylum in New York City. Grand, glorious buildings that they said was built in the early 1800s at the time of horse and buggy. Here's another. It's called Colored Orphan Asylum. I think this is for black children in New York City at the time, and there were several of these. They were segregated. At that time, you'll see that there were separate for just boys sometimes for different ethnicities, like the Hebrew orphan asylums that we'll see coming up. But all these were placed together. Illuminati people in charge indoctrinated them in Satan's little season of the New World Order that was upcoming, and erasing the past history from their memories. But again, look at the Romanesque architecture of this building in the early 1800s in New York. Again, it says Colored Orphan Asylum in New York City, and trying to look at the date of that. But again, all of these are 1800s. This talks about Tartarian architecture here in the heading on the right. And the topic of Tartaria, I think, came along a few years ago, looking at these old world buildings, grouping them into an era known as Tartaria. I think that basically Tartaria was a large kingdom in Russia, in Asia, Siberia area that had old world buildings in it from the millennial kingdom of Christ. And this empire went all the way down to China. We see the Great Wall of China in old maps being a separation between the Chinese and Tartarian empires of that time, several hundred years ago. But I don't think that all these buildings that you see, like this one here in New York City, was, quote, Tartarian architecture. I think this was millennial kingdom architecture throughout the world, and that we simply see the same type buildings that we see in New York and Europe, we saw in Russia and Asia, that was known at that time as Tartaria. Here's another orphan asylum in the 1800s in New York, the Roman Catholic Orphan Asylum for boys. And again, you see horse and buggy in the foreground and this large, glorious building in the background that they say was built in the early 1800s. And going back to my last video, looking at the guardians and caretakers of these orphan houses, it makes you wonder what is behind the veil right here. Is everything as innocent as it looks here? This looks bizarre to me. This says Charity Bazaar, Love Bazaar, and this is truly bizarre in what I'm seeing here. This does not look right, to say the least. But this is a flyer from the St. Vincent Infant Asylum. And I showed you who was in charge of a lot of these orphan asylums and their dress, and under the veil what they really were. And I think the same goes for here, looking just at the profile, and the hands and the shoulder width and everything else. So you can kind of use your imagination a little bit if you don't know what I'm saying. Again, that's who is in charge this time. This is a big cult in Satan's little season. And they have their own symbols. They have their own rituals. And they show it right in front of you. And we see it today in our media. We see the same people in our media today. We see them in leadership roles of world governments, their spouses, the first ladies. We see them as heads in healthcare, in education. Just look at the leaders of the United States healthcare and educational systems. And you'll see what I mean. But continuing, another orphan asylum. This is on 74th Street and Bloomingdale Road in New York City at the time. And you can see the New York Orphan Asylum. Again, why would they build these glorious buildings with these magnificent spires, these arches, the cathedral look, where they only have horse and buggy, no modern construction equipment? But why would they build something so grand and glorious for orphans? Again, the Freemasons, the Illuminati, found these buildings. They repurposed them. They renovated them to transform them into orphan asylums. Asylum is a word that used to mean a safe refuge or shelter. But these asylums for the insane and orphans were far from that. These were re-educational centers, and there's no telling what all occurred during these time periods in all these different orphanages during the early part of Satan's little season. Here's another orphan asylum. Says this site is to be demolished at the bottom here, the PE Orphan Asylum. But this, like many others, were demolished. You can see beautiful grand structures, but then modernized, transformed to conform it to an orphanage during the time of Satan's little season and during this transitional time where families were broken up in order for the new narrative to be proclaimed throughout the world. And those who didn't go along with it ended up in places like this. Here's another one in New York City. And again, this is a same picture twice, but you can see just the beautiful architecture, the spires. Again, this is the Hebrew Orphan Asylum that I was referring to earlier on Amsterdam Avenue. I think this has been demolished too since this photograph. But again, this huge building. This is an old world building. This is built not in the early 1800s for the housing of orphans. This was built during the Millennial Kingdom for the purposes of housing believers, those within the kingdom, for to glorify God, to proclaim the word of God, and to continue the spread of the good news of Jesus Christ to the world. But after the end of that kingdom on earth and the beginning of Satan's little season, this was used for other purposes by the Illuminati. Again, another picture. This was a Protestant orphan asylum. So now we're starting to further divide not only skin color, ethnicity, boys, girls, but also religious beliefs. Like I said, there's so many false churches, gospels that came into the world in the early 1800s. Just in the United States, you see the beginning of Mormonism, Jehovah's Witness, Seventh-day Adventism. You see all these false religion come in during this time period, and just further and further segregate the churches. Satan's minions coming into the churches, into the seminaries, unawares, to divide and conquer. That's why we have so many different types of churches today. In Satan's little season, the church has been segregated and divided so much. It is so weak that, everybody within it practically is spiritually blind to what's going on. And then finally, this is the Brooklyn Orphan Asylum, I think, that we saw at the beginning, and this is the kitchen of it. So this is repurposed old world building that has been repurposed into a kitchen. I don't know if it has new flooring or this is original flooring. And we talked about the checkerboard flooring, and was this an actual design within old world buildings of the Millennial Kingdom that the Freemasons simply adopted and then used as their symbology? Or was this something new to this New World Order and was part of the renovations of these old world buildings into something of use in Satan's little season? So finally, why were all these orphanages needed in the 1800s in New York City? Orphanage after orphanage you can see throughout this slide. And this is just a few of these old world buildings that were converted into orphanages during this time. Why were so many needed in New York specifically? Well, I think we see this in New York because New York was a hub of child trafficking in the early 1800s, during the early part of Satan's little season, when all these rebellions were going on throughout the world. Again, as I mentioned previously, after the release of Satan from the abyss and the establishment of the New World Order through the help of his followers within the Illuminati and Freemasonry that were placed in positions of power, that these wars that were going on simultaneously were a result of this rebellion from the Millennial Reign of Christ. And that, for instance, the Napoleonic Wars, like I mentioned earlier, that I think that there was a lot of families broken up during these decades all over the world. In Europe, specifically, I think in London, for instance, there's a lot of orphanages. In Paris, there is a lot of orphanages. And I think that a lot of families were broken up throughout Europe and Asia. You see in Russia, there were a lot in Moscow. And that families were broken up, placed into insane asylums, and then the children were transported to these major hubs throughout the world in their region and distributed into several of these re-educational centers run by the Illuminati. That's why I think we see so many in New York City during the 1800s. This was a major hub where the children went to be re-educated. And probably many Ivy League professors are descendants from these brainwashed, re-educated people, or they are part of the cult of the Illuminati who continue to do the same today to our youth. And I'm not just picking on the Ivy League. I'm just saying that because we're looking at New York City here, but this happens all over the world. So when you see these old world buildings and you see them as orphanages, as insane asylums, know that this was basically signifying this period of time this transitional period from the end of the millennial kingdom of Christ into Satan's little season and the beginning of its establishment going into the 1800s and early 20th century. We're the descendants of these kids coming out of the Millennial Reign of Christ into Satan's little season and have been indoctrinated. We're continuing to be indoctrinated through our universities, just like this. They don't call them university asylums, but that's what they are. They're basically indoctrination centers. You have to have critical thinkers. You have to be grounded in the Word of God to see through the deception and the lies in our educational centers, in everything that we see in the world today. Basically, there's not a part of this world that hasn't gotten corrupted by those that are placing their allegiance to Satan, Luciferians, in this little season. So that is the end of this video, and we'll do another soon. God bless.